Some people get into nursing because they couldn't get into medical school. That is what Dr. Pierce said 17 minutes before the patient in room for 12 whispered a word that would destroy him. Katie Rodriguez moves through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Oak Creek Memorial in Houston like someone who has learned to occupy space without disturbing it. Her scrubs are pressed with military precision. Her movements economical, controlled, the kind of physical efficiency that comes from doing critical work under pressure when pressure meant lives. The other nurses notice this about her. They don't comment on it. She has been at Oak Creek for 6 months and has somehow become the person they ask when they can't find an answer, even though she deflects every question with a soft voice and a redirect back to protocol. Dr. Vincent Pierce, Chief of Surgery, also notices. He has been noticing since her first week. He watches from the nurse's station as she inserts a peripheral for into a diabetic patient's scarred forearm, a vein most residents would miss, the needle going in at the exact angle that minimizes tissue trauma, the flash of blood appearing in the chamber like confirmation. She secures it with practiced efficiency. The patient thanks her. She nods once and moves to the next task. Pierce's jaw tightens. He is a man who has spent 32 years climbing a hierarchy that requires everyone below him to clearly understand their place, and Katie Rodriguez seems to have missed that memo. The whispers about her background begin casually. In the break room. At the nursing station during shift change. Did you see her credentials? I heard her verification is pending. My cousin went to UTEP. She doesn't remember anyone named Rodriguez in the program. Pierce doesn't start the whispers directly. He is too intelligent for that. He plants them like seeds, a casual mention to a resident that it's unusual for a nurse to have no prior work history, a concerned comment to the nursing supervisor about the administrative delay in her background check, a raised eyebrow when she speaks up in a case conference that suggests someone without proper credentials shouldn't be so confident. The whispers grow. They spread through the hospital like an infection he has carefully cultivated, and he watches from doorways with satisfaction as nurses who once sought her advice begin gathering their lunch trays and leaving when she sits down. What Dr. Pierce does not know is that Katie Rodriguez has survived worse than whispers. Far worse. What he cannot see is the single dog tag hanging on a broken chain that she keeps in the deep pocket of her scrubs, which she touches during her breaks while sitting alone in the stairwell where nobody can see her hands tremor when helicopter rotors pass overhead from the flight pad 3 blocks away. What he cannot imagine is that her nursing skills, her precision with procedures, her ability to read a patient's trajectory before the monitors confirm it, did not come from any nursing school he could verify. They came from a field hospital in Kandahar where the power failed twice a week. They came from a forward operating base in Bagram where medical supplies meant choosing between 3 critical patients and 2 medications. They came from hands that have held together things that were breaking, in circumstances that Dr. Pierce's institutional hierarchy would never require him to contemplate. The morning Katie arrives at Oak Creek, the credentials in her file list a school in El Paso with verification pending. The verification has been pending for 6 months. It will remain pending. The school in El Paso cannot verify her credentials because those credentials do not exist in any civilian database. When Dr. Pierce pulls her employee file on his secure workstation and sees the red flag noting the incomplete background check, he smiles the smile of a man who has just found the leverage he was looking for. He finds her in the hallway outside room 407, where she has just changed the dressing on a post-operative knee replacement. She is disposing of the old sterile gloves in the biohazard bin. Her movements are methodical. She does not rush. She is the kind of person who makes efficiency look like calm. Miss Rodriguez. A moment. His voice carries the weight of institutional authority. He does not phrase it as a request. She turns to face him. Her eyes are steady. Most people, when confronted by a superior officer, he does not use that language, but it is how he thinks of himself. Most people's eyes shift. Hers do not. She waits. The fluorescent lights hum above them with the particular frequency that has started to make her head ache by the end of long shifts. We need to talk about your background check, he says. He is testing her. Watching for the panic response, the defensive reaction, the trembling hands of someone caught in a lie. She takes one measured breath through her nose. Her hands remain steady. When she speaks, her voice is low and even, the kind of composure that comes from understanding that panic kills people faster than wounds do. I have provided everything HR requested, Doctor. Yet verification remains pending. He steps closer, using proximity as a pressure tactic. It is unusual for a nursing school to delay credential confirmation, particularly from a graduate who was there recently enough to remember the faculty. The school is verifying records from 6 years ago. They process requests quarterly. Her voice does not rise. It does not soften either. It simply states fact. I have no control over their timeline, sir. Sir. The word is correct, the tone is respectful, but there is something underneath it that Dr. Pierce cannot quite name. It is not subservience. It is something closer to professional courtesy offered to someone he should not need to explain himself to. It infuriates him. I would hope, he says, that someone in your position would understand the importance of institutional standards. Not everyone is suited for nursing, Miss Rodriguez. Some people pursue it because they lack the academic credentials for medical school. He pauses. He wants her to feel the weight of that. They find themselves struggling in an environment that requires actual training. Her expression does not change. Not a flicker. Not a flush in her cheeks. Not a sharp intake of breath. She stands there in scrubs that have a small bloodstain on the left sleeve from the fore-insertion, and she simply looks at him. The silence lasts approximately 3 seconds. Then she says, I will continue to provide excellent patient care, doctor. See that you do, he says. Quietly. She nods once, the kind of nod that could be interpreted as acknowledgement or agreement or simply a decision to end the conversation. She disposes of her gloves in the biohazard bin and returns to her tasks. Dr. Pierce watches her move back toward room for 12, the next patient on her list, a Special Forces medic admitted for blast-related injuries, and he feels the satisfaction of having planted another seed, watered another doubt, reinforced another whisper about whether she truly belongs here. What he does not see is that she stops for just a moment at room 412's doorway. What he does not see is the way the patient's eyes go wide when he reads her name on the whiteboard. What he does not know is that 3 years ago in Bagram, when the generator died and a medic named Corporal Hayes was bleeding out with shrapnel in his chest and the surgeon had abandoned the FOB for a medevac that would take 40 minutes to arrive, a woman whose official title no longer existed anywhere in any system pulled a combat knife from her field pack and made the kind of incision that should not have worked but did. She had placed her own dog tag in his hand afterward, the one hanging now in Katie Rodriguez's pocket, and told him one thing, survive. The family gathered around Corporal Hayes's bed shifted uncomfortably as Dr. Pierce entered room for 12, his white coat moving like a sail, 2 residents trailing behind him like remoras. Katie was checking the post-operative medications on the chart when she felt the temperature in the room drop. Pierce picked up Hayes's file, his jaw tightening as he scanned the orders. The fluorescent lights hummed above them. Miss Rodriguez, Pierce said, loud enough for the family to hear. This dosage is completely inappropriate. Did you even read my orders? Katie kept her voice level. Doctor, I followed your written orders exactly. Don't make excuses. He held the chart up like evidence at a trial. This is the problem with nurses who think they know better than physicians. You're creating liability for this hospital. The family members exchanged glances. Hayes's mother reached for her son's hand. Pierce stepped closer, and Katie noticed he positioned himself between her and the bed, a deliberate territorial move. We'll need to discuss this with administration. Katie took one measured breath. She didn't look away from his eyes. The silence lasted 3 seconds, long enough for everyone to hear the ventilator wheeze beside the bed, long enough for Corporal Hayes's mother to grip the bed rail. One tear escaped Katie's eye. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and when she spoke, her voice was steady as a metronome. The chart will show I followed your orders exactly, Doctor. Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just found the lever to break something. We'll see what the chart shows, charity case. He used the nickname deliberately, a public knife. He turned on his heel and walked out, the resident scrambling to follow, and Katie stood there in the sudden silence of the room while Hayes's mother looked at her with an expression that mixed gratitude and pity. But that wasn't the worst part. Over the next 3 days, Pierce moved with calculated precision. During surgical rounds, he planted whispers in the ears of select staff, nurses he'd cultivated over years of small favors and implied threats. Credibility concerns, he murmured to the charge nurse. Unverified background. Might want to be careful with critical patients. To a resident, has she always been evasive about her training? To the hospital's infection control officer, strange gaps in her employment history. Very strange. Nothing provable. Nothing documented. Just enough doubt, seeded in enough ears, to make the entire unit question whether they were standing next to a competent nurse or a liability walking on 2 legs. Katie felt it shift like a change in barometric pressure. On Tuesday, when she sat down in the break room with her lunch container, reheated chicken and rice, something that required no attention, just fuel, 3 nurses who had spent the previous week asking her advice about difficult patients gathered their things without a word and moved to the far table. One of them wouldn't meet her eyes. The conversation there continued at the same volume, but Katie could feel it was about her. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, aware of the fluorescent lights overhead that seemed too bright, that seemed designed to illuminate her isolation. Through the break room window, Dr. Pierce stood in the hallway outside, arms crossed, watching her. His satisfaction was visible. It was written on his face like a signature. Wednesday afternoon, Pierce made his move. On the unit bulletin board where all staff gathered during shift change, where notices about new policies and staff schedules lived, he posted an official disciplinary document. The letterhead read Oak Creek Memorial Hospital, Human Resources. The language was precise, clinical, devastating. It cited Nurse K. Rodriguez for insubordination, dangerous independence of judgment, and failure to respect established medical hierarchy. The notice carried the official stamp. It was dated and witnessed. It was real enough to stick. Staff gathered to read it before Katie's shift started. She arrived to find a small cluster of people, nurses, a resident, an aide, gathered near the board. They scattered as she approached, as though proximity to her might be contagious. She read the notice silently. Her eyes moved across each line. Her hands didn't shake. The room stayed quiet except for the ambient hum of hospital machinery somewhere distant. One tear escaped her right eye. She wiped it away without looking away from the paper, without changing her expression, and turned to see Dr. Pierce positioned strategically at the far end of the hallway, watching her reaction with the focus of a snake tracking heat. She held his gaze for 2 seconds. Then she spoke quietly enough that only he could hear, though her voice carried like a command. I've served under worse. She turned and walked directly to room 412, her badge catching the fluorescent light as she moved. Behind her, Dr. Pierce's satisfied expression flickered. Not because he was concerned, but because something in her voice suggested he'd miscalculated. She wasn't breaking. She wasn't folding. She was doing something far more dangerous. She was becoming resolute. Corporal Hayes lay sedated in his bed when she entered, the monitors casting their soft blue glow across his young face. Fresh surgical staples ran down his chest like a scar map. According to his chart, he was 24 years old, admitted 3 days ago with catastrophic chest trauma sustained in Bagram. His previous medical records were scattered, incomplete, flagged with restricted markings that suggested military involvement. But what caught Katie's attention was something that made her hands pause as she documented his vitals. His chart noted he'd replaced a field medic who had been transferred out 3 years ago under classified circumstances. 3 years. The exact timeline. She didn't let her face show anything as she checked his telemetry, made notes, and positioned herself to observe his post-operative healing. His vitals looked stable. His oxygen saturation was solid. His heart rhythm was regular. Everything on the monitor displayed the green steady pulse of a body beginning to recover. But Katie had learned something in Bagram that no peacetime nursing program could teach. She'd learned to read the subtle shifts, the way a patient's breathing changed just slightly before it became critical, the way pupils dilated a fraction of a second before consciousness slipped away, the small warnings that meant the difference between saving someone and watching them die. And as she stood there adjusting his full line on Friday afternoon, she felt something shift in his vitals, subtle as a distant tremor. His heart rate was climbing. 68. 74. 82. His blood pressure was dropping. 130/88. 125/85. 120/80. She hit the call button. "What's his status?" the charge nurse called through the intercom. "Vitals destabilizing," Katie said, keeping her voice calm. "Get me respiratory. Get me an attending. Code cart to room for 12. She bent over Corporal Hayes, assessing him, her hands moving through the practice sequences of emergency assessment. She checked his dressing. No external bleeding. She listened to his lungs. Clear bilaterally. She checked his central line. Patent. But something was wrong, something internal, something that the monitors could sense but couldn't name. His eyes fluttered open for just 1 second. His pupils focused on her face. His lips moved, forming a single word she almost caught before his sternum erupted. The sutures rupture with a soft sound, not loud, not dramatic, just a small tearing of fresh surgical closure. Blood bloomed across his dressing like a flower opening. His heart rhythm on the monitor went from steady to chaotic. 140 beats per minute. 180. Then the line went flat. Katie didn't wait for the code team. She could hear them coming from the far end of the unit, but she knew the math. 70 seconds until chest compressions. 90 seconds until medication. 120 seconds until defibrillation. Corporal Hayes had 40 seconds before his brain started dying. She grabbed a sterile scalpel from the crash cart, 14-gauge, surgical steel, and made the thoracotomy incision with movements so precise they looked choreographed, so confident they looked impossible. She split his ribs in one smooth motion, opened the pericardium, and reached into his chest cavity. His heart was distended, blood pooling around it, but it wasn't torn. It was tangled. Somehow, impossibly, his surgical repair had twisted during recovery, folding back on itself, obstructing blood flow. Katie's hands began to work. Manual cardiac massage. Direct compressions. She'd done this exactly 3 times in her life, all of them in Bagram, all of them under small arms fire or mortar impact or the rotor wash of a rescue helicopter. Her hands remembered what her conscious mind wasn't supposed to know. The residents arrived and froze in the doorway. They watched a nurse, a woman with a chart that listed question marks and a reputation pieced together from whispers, compress the heart of a special forces medic with the precise efficiency of a trauma surgeon in a forward operating base. Her movements were wrong for a civilian nurse. Too confident. Too practiced. The intern whispered something, but the resident beside him said nothing because he understood that he was watching someone operate on an entirely different level. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway at exactly 45 seconds into the code. He watched Katie's hands work. He watched her adjust the compression angle. He watched her call out orders, push epi, 1 mg 4. Suspend compressions. Check for obstruction. He watched the residents obey without question, moving with the kind of urgency that came from authority, not hierarchy. He watched her manually clear the twisted surgical repair, felt her manipulate the cardiac position, resume compressions. Corporal Hayes' heart resumed beating at exactly 73 seconds. The monitor showed sinus rhythm. His blood pressure climbed. 80/50. 90/60. 105/70. Katie didn't look up. She was already calling for sutures to close the emergency incision, already checking his pupils, already assessing his oxygen saturation. The residents moved with her like she was conducting an orchestra. When it was done, when Hayes was stable again and the code team was securing medications and drawing blood and running the post-resuscitation protocols, Katie stepped back from the bed. She pulled off her gloves. She documented the emergency procedure in the chart with clinical precision. And only then did she notice Dr. Pierce still standing in the doorway. He wasn't congratulating her. He wasn't showing relief. His face showed something far more dangerous than anger. It showed calculation. He watched her clean her hands, watched her return to her steady competence, watched her move like someone who had just fought a battle and won. His expression shifted to something that looked almost like fear, and then it shifted again into something far worse. It shifted into the look of a man beginning to plan how to bury what he'd just witnessed. Katie felt his eyes on her back as she left the room, but she didn't acknowledge him. She returned to her documentation. She checked on her other patients. She continued her shift with the same steady professionalism she'd maintained since the moment Dr. Pierce had first looked at her with contempt. But something had changed in that room. Something had shifted. The quiet nurse was still quiet. But now there was weight behind the silence. Now there was gravity. Now there was the undeniable evidence that the woman standing in this hospital was not who the whispers had suggested. The real nightmare was just beginning. Room for 12 was quiet except for the ventilator's mechanical wheeze and the steady beep of the cardiac monitor. Katie pushed the vitals cart through the doorway at 6:47 a.m., the fluorescent lights casting everything in that antiseptic white that made wounds look worse than they were. Corporal Hayes lay sedated, his chest wrapped tight in surgical dressings, the sternum sutures holding him together like the last thread on a grenade pin. She'd seen worse in Kandahar. She'd held worse in her hands. But that was before the evacuation. Before the erasure. Before Houston. She checked the ventilator settings first, standard protocol, then moved to his left side where the 4 lines ran like tributaries into a delta of plastic tubing. The bag of fluids was nearly empty. She made a mental note to call for a replacement, her eye scanning his vitals on the monitor, blood pressure 118/72, oxygen saturation 97% on the ventilator, heart rate steady at 78. Stable. The kind of stable that meant he was healing. The kind of stable that meant he might wake up soon and remember her from somewhere he shouldn't. She reached for his wrist to check for swelling, her fingers pressing gently against the pulse point. His skin was warm. The trembling wasn't fear. It was something else, muscle memory recognizing something it had buried. 3 years ago she'd held this same wrist in the back of a Black Hawk, telling him to survive, telling him to stay conscious while the rotor wash shook the aircraft and the Taliban rounds punched through the fuselage like angry hornets. She'd placed her dog tag in his hand that day. The one still in her pocket. The one she couldn't wear anymore because wearing it meant admitting she existed. The sutures held his sternum together in a line that looked almost surgical. Almost. But Katie could see the slight swelling around stitch 4 and stitch 7, the way the inflammation was pulling at the knots. She made another note, check with Pierce about topical antibiotic application. The thought made her jaw clench. Pierce wouldn't celebrate what she'd done. He'd already started calculating how to bury it. She was reaching for his blood pressure cuff when Hayes's body did something it shouldn't. A sharp movement. A gasp that bypassed the sedation. The monitor's beeping accelerated from a trot to a sprint, and Katie's hands froze for exactly half a second before her training took over. The sutures weren't just pulling. They were rupturing. She could see it happening, the separation of his sternum, the pressure releasing from the sternal wound like air escaping from a punctured lung. Then came the sound that every trauma nurse dreads, the flat line. Not a crash. A death sentence delivered in a single monotone wail. Katie's hands were already moving. She pressed the call button while simultaneously reaching for the code crash cart positioned outside every ICU room, her movements fluid as water finding a crack. The overhead system crackled, code blue, room for 12. Code blue, room for 12. The words echoed through the hallway like a bell tolling, and she could hear the percussion of running feet in the distance, but they were 40 seconds away minimum. Hayes wasn't 40 seconds away. Hayes was 40 heartbeats away from brain death, and his heart wasn't beating. She grabbed the surgical tray from the crash cart. The scalpel was already in her hand before she consciously decided to move. The blade caught the fluorescent light as she prepped his chest with an alcohol swab, the movement automatic as breathing, automatic as the 237 times she'd done this exact procedure in conditions infinitely worse. In the heat of Kandahar, with sand in the wound and incoming fire turning the sky into something alive and angry. In the back of a transport helicopter with nothing but a combat knife and a prayer and a dying soldier. The incision was clean. A single vertical line from the second intercostal space down through the fifth, through skin and fascia and muscle, the sternum already separated enough to give her access. The blood came warm across her gloved hands, but she didn't feel it. Pain was information, and right now information was that his pericardium was intact, the heart itself still and blue in the cavity of his chest. She could smell the copper and the antiseptic mixing into something that smelled like memory. Her hand closed around his heart. The muscle was slack. Unresponsive. She began the compression, a steady squeeze and release, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who'd learned this skill in the worst classroom on earth. Squeeze. The heart was soft, responsive to pressure, like holding something alive and breaking it simultaneously. Release. Let the blood redistribute. Squeeze again. Feel for the response. Push harder. The ribs flexed under her palm like a cage trying to contain something wild. The monitor remained a flat line, an accusing silence that lasted 3 seconds, then 5, then 8. The code team burst through the door. She could hear their voices, the crash of equipment being dropped, someone shouting, "What do we have?" But Katie didn't stop compressing. Couldn't stop. The moment she stopped, Hayes would be dead. It was that simple and that complicated. Epinephrine, 1 milligram 4 push, she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser, cutting through the chaos. Someone behind her scrambled to comply. Get me a defibrillator pad. His chest is open. Manual compression only until we stabilize rhythm. Who the hell is, a resident started, but one of the nurses cut him off. It's Rodriguez. She's got this. 10 seconds. Her hands worked the muscle, feeling for any response, any flicker of returning consciousness in the organ. Squeeze and release. Squeeze and release. The movement was meditation and violence combined, precise and brutal. 15 seconds. 20. The blood was warm across her wrists now, had soaked through her first set of gloves, and she could feel the sutures beginning to separate further under the pressure, but that didn't matter because a dead man with intact sutures was still dead. We have sinus rhythm, the monitor operator called out, her voice climbing with hope. We have a pulse. He's got a pulse. Katie checked the compression. Yes. The heart under her palm was moving now, contracting on its own, remembering how to live. The monitor shifted from flat line to jagged peaks, irregular but present, like a man climbing out of a well one handhold at a time. Oxygen saturation began climbing, 62%, 71%, 84%. Climbing toward life. She stepped back slowly, her hands falling away from his chest, and that's when she saw him. Dr. Pierce standing in the doorway, watching. Not rushing forward to take over. Not calling for backup. Just watching, his expression cycling through something complex and cold. First surprise. Then calculation. Then something that looked almost like satisfaction, except satisfaction didn't make a man's eyes go dead like that. The code team took over seamlessly, working with the kind of synchronized precision that came from doing this dance dozens of times before. But Pierce wasn't moving to assist. He was watching Katie like a scientist observing an unexpected reaction in a petri dish, with clinical interest and zero joy. Get me something for the sternum, Katie said to the nearest surgical resident, still not breaking her gaze from Pierce. I need to prevent further separation while we stabilize his rhythm. Sterile dressing and surgical tape. Now. The resident moved without questioning. That was how authority worked. It had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with hands that knew how to hold life together in impossible places. In rooms that were too hot and too loud and too full of people trying to die. in moments where indecision meant irrelevance. She was reaching for the sterile dressing when Pierce finally moved. Not toward Hayes. Toward the door. He turned slowly, deliberately, and his eyes met Katie's one last time before he stepped into the hallway. In that look was everything he'd calculated, the fact that she'd saved a patient's life using skills a civilian nurse should never possess. The fact that witnesses had seen it. The fact that the secret he'd been trying to build a case against was now standing in blood-soaked gloves in the middle of an ICU, having just performed a procedure that would require either a miracle or a hidden identity to explain. She finished taping the sternum. The monitor showed a stable rhythm now, 82 beats per minute, the heart remembering how to work. Someone was calling for a repeat EKG, someone else was pushing more fluids, and Katie stepped back to let them work, her blood-covered gloves dripping scarlet onto the tile floor. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the calculation she'd seen in Pierce's eyes. Not anger. Not the righteous fury of someone caught trying to destroy an innocent person. No. What she'd seen was a man realizing that his carefully constructed plan had just become infinitely more complex. That the nurse he'd decided to dismantle was something far more dangerous than he'd understood. That whatever victory he'd been imagining was about to require weapons he hadn't prepared yet. Within 2 hours of saving Corporal Hayes' life, Dr. Pierce moved with the precision of a surgeon removing a tumor. He didn't celebrate. He didn't acknowledge the miracle that had just occurred in Trauma Bay 3. Instead, he sat in his office with the door closed and made 3 phone calls that would reshape the landscape of Katie's survival. The first call reassigned the surgical residents who'd witnessed everything. Both of them. Gone by shift change. One transferred to pediatrics, the other to a rotation in pathology, positions that would keep them far from any room where Katie might be asked what she'd seen. Pierce's voice was smooth, administrative, impossible to argue with. Manpower reallocation, he'd said. Budget constraints. The residents never questioned it. They were too junior, too eager to please, too unaware that they'd just watched a woman commit what might have been the most textbook emergency thoracotomy performed in this hospital's recorded history. The second call altered the overnight schedule. The records of the emergency, the code team notification, the crash cart activation, the blood products administered, the vitals log during manual cardiac massage, all of it was reassigned to a night shift supervisor who owed Pierce a favor. A supervisor who understood that some files could be misfiled, some digital timestamps could be questioned, some records could simply vanish into the infrastructure of an overwhelmed hospital system where thousands of pages of documentation moved through processing every single day. By morning, anyone looking for proof of what Katie had done would find only fragments, inconsistencies, a story that didn't quite add up. The third call was the architect of everything. Pierce dialed the hospital administrator's direct line, his voice carrying the weight of institutional concern. Not accusation. Never accusation. Just a colleague raising a question that needed asking. "I have concerns," he'd said, "about an employee performing an authorized surgical intervention. I've documented it. She performed a thoracotomy without proper credentialing. No surgical fellowship, no trauma board certification, nothing. I'm obligated to report this to the state licensing board. I wanted to give you the courtesy of advance notice." The administrator listened. The administrator understood. Within an hour, the state licensing board had received a carefully worded letter questioning whether Oak Creek Memorial was adequately vetting its clinical staff. Pierce's fourth move was the one that broke the final link between Katie and any way to speak to Hayes again. He restricted her access to room for 12. Not formally, not yet, nothing that would create documentation. Just a quiet word to the charge nurse, "I'd prefer if non-essential staff remain out of that room while he stabilizes. Let's keep variables controlled." The charge nurse nodded. She had no reason not to trust him. He was the chief of surgery. By the time Katie finished her shift and tried to check on the patient she'd saved, the room was locked behind a policy that appeared to materialize from nowhere. 18 hours after performing the thoracotomy, Katie was called to Dr. Pierce's office. It wasn't a request. It was a command delivered by a nurse manager who wouldn't make eye contact. Dr. Pierce needs to see you. Now. Katie was wearing her scrubs still, streaked with dried blood from the previous night, blood that wouldn't wash out, blood that had belonged to a man whose heart had stopped beating until her hands brought it back. She walked down the corridor of Oak Creek Memorial, past the ICU where Corporal Hayes was probably waking up right now, past the break room where no one would sit with her, past the unit board where her name was no longer on the assignment list. Dr. Pierce's office smelled like expensive cologne and leather. The hospital administrator sat in the corner chair, a woman named Chen who'd never spoken to Katie directly before. A third person was there too, someone from HR, someone with a folder, someone whose entire job was documenting the dissolution of lives that didn't fit the system. Pierce sat behind his desk with the folder open in front of him like a surgeon reviewing an autopsy report. Miss Rodriguez, we're terminating your employment effective immediately for gross violation of protocol and fraudulent representation. His voice was calm. Professional. The voice of a man with institutional authority backing every single word. Katie's hands remained still in her lap. Perfectly still. Not trembling. Not clenched. Just resting there like they belonged to someone else. I saved that patient's life, she said quietly. You performed a surgical procedure without authorization, the administrator said, her tone gentle, almost sympathetic. And Dr. Pierce has raised concerns about your credentials that we cannot verify or resolve. Pierce leaned forward, and his eyes held something that looked like satisfaction. Where did you actually train, Miss Rodriguez? Because El Paso Community College has no record of a nursing diploma under your name. What are you really hiding? The question hung in the air like sediment settling in water. Katie took one measured breath, and for just a moment, for one fraction of a second, she considered telling them everything. That she couldn't provide her credentials because a classified medevac operation went catastrophically wrong in Bagram 3 years ago. That 18 Allied operatives survived only because she stayed behind and held a forward trauma bay alone for 11 hours while mortar rounds impacted the perimeter. That the military erased her service record and ordered her to disappear. That officially, according to every government database, Katie Rodriguez, the Army combat medic, did not exist. That officially, only Katie Rodriguez, the civilian nurse with manufactured credentials, could survive. The truth was a weapon she'd learned not to draw. I've told you everything I can, she said instead. Pierce smiled. It was the smile of a man who understood that her silence was confirmation of exactly what he wanted to believe. That story only confirms you're delusional. Security will escort you out. You'll have 15 minutes to collect your personal items from your locker and then you'll need to vacate the premises. The security guard was waiting in the hallway. He held out a cardboard box, the kind used for files, for documents, for the remnants of people who used to work here. He didn't meet her eyes. He was just doing his job. Katie took the box and walked back down the corridor, back past the ICU, back past the break room, back to the locker that had held her scrubs and her one spare pair of shoes and the dog tag on the broken chain that she kept tucked in the deepest corner, hidden even from herself. She didn't remove anything from the walls first. She just pulled the locker door open and grabbed what was hers, knowing that whatever she left behind belonged to Oak Creek Memorial now. The dog tag went into her pocket. Everything else, the stethoscope, the penlight, the scissors with their worn handles, went into the cardboard box. The parking garage was silent when she walked into it. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of artificial yellow that made you forget what time of day it was. She unlocked her car, a 2007 Nissan Altima with a dent in the side panel and 187,000 miles on it, and set the cardboard box in the passenger seat. Then she sat down in the driver's seat and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. She couldn't turn the key. Her hands knew how. They were capable hands, steady hands, hands that had sutured arteries and started central lines and performed a thoracotomy with a surgical blade in a combat zone, but they wouldn't turn the key. Because for the first time since the evacuation, since the classified operation went wrong, since she'd been ordered to disappear and given a civilian identity and told never to speak of the people she'd saved, she had nowhere left to run. No identity left to hide behind. No career that could serve as a shield. No future that looked like anything except the cardboard box in her passenger seat and the parking garage and the lights humming overhead like they were counting down to something. The dog tag lay in her other palm. Just metal. Just a string of numbers and a name that officially didn't exist. She held it there in the darkness of the car, feeling the weight of it, understanding that this was the only thing tying her to the person she actually was. 2 floors above her, Corporal Hayes opened his eyes. 2 days later, Katie was collecting her belongings from her locker when she heard the commotion. Not a code blue, something else. Voices rising in the ICU. Urgent but not panicked. She paused, her hand frozen on a stack of folded scrubs, listening to the pitch shift down the corridor. Then she heard it. The security guard's voice, steady and practiced, "Sir, you need to let the medical team work. A patient refusing treatment." That much was clear. But the words that followed stopped her cold. "Get me Sandstorm. I'm not doing anything until Sandstorm walks through that door." The name traveled through the unit like electricity through water. Whispered from one nurse station to the next. Sandstorm. 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 Not a code. Not a procedure. A code name. The word reached the administrator's office on the 3rd floor, and something in his expression changed as he listened to the description of the patient, former Special Forces medic, refusing all treatment, asking for someone who shouldn't exist anymore, someone who'd been erased from every official record 3 years ago when the exfiltration went sideways and the Pentagon made certain people disappear. He made a single phone call. The chaplain arrived first, carrying a leather portfolio marked classified across its spine. He moved with the quietude of someone accustomed to delivering impossible truths. Behind him, the admiral in dress whites, not a hospital administrator, not a bureaucrat, but a man who carried authority the way other people carried air. His uniform caught the fluorescent light. His eyes swept the ICU once, cataloging everything. Then he stepped into Hayes's room, and the machine seemed to straighten. 2 men in dark suits arrived next, moving with the fluid precision of people trained to be invisible until they needed not to be. Their credentials read CIA, but there was something older in their bearing, the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. A crowd gathered outside Hayes's room. Slowly at first. Then all of it. Nurses who'd ignored Katie in the break room. Residents who'd whispered about her credentials. The nursing director. The night shift supervisor. They lined the corridor in growing silence, because something was happening that transcended the ordinary hierarchy of the hospital. Something that made the usual rules feel small. Inside the room, Corporal Hayes pushed himself upright despite the pain, his eyes fixed on the doorway with the intensity of someone who'd been waiting 3 years for this moment. "Captain Katie Rodriguez," he rasped. His voice cracked. His hands trembled, actual trembling, the kind that comes from being alive after believing you'd die in the dust. "That's who I need." The chaplain opened the portfolio. The room filled with the sound of papers being turned, the soft rustle of declassified documents, the whisper of secrets becoming truth. He began to read aloud, his voice carrying the weight of official confirmation, Special Forces Operational Group, Kandahar Province, 2019 through 2021. Forward Operating Base Bagram, Classified Medical Operations, 3 consecutive deployments, Field Surgical Capacity. Each line landed like a brick being laid. Katie's name. Her rank. Her unit designation. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, a dark horse. The documentation of someone who'd been erased was being erased, piece by piece, in front of witnesses. The Admiral stepped forward. His hand rested on Hayes's shoulder, not a gesture of comfort, but of acknowledgement. "Silver Star," he said, his voice cutting through the silence of the corridor beyond. The staff outside the door exchanged glances. "Bronze Star." Another moment. "Second Bronze Star." The weight accumulated. Each decoration was its own sentence. Each represented a decision made in darkness, a choice between protocol and survival, a choice made correctly when correctness meant staying alive. The CIA officials moved to the foot of the bed. One of them held up a photograph, satellite imagery, a forward operating base, a perimeter marked in red. Exfiltration Operation Sandstorm, March 2021. 18 Allied operatives extracted from hostile territory. 0 casualties. The operation succeeded because of one medical officer who performed field surgery under fire, who kept people breathing when breathing should have been impossible, who carried the weight of 18 lives out of that valley. He looked directly at the corridor full of staff. That officer is Captain Katie Rodriguez. Codename Sandstorm. She was ordered to assume a new identity and disappear for her own protection. Until now. The whispers exploded. Sandstorm. The invisible operator. The medic who'd saved half the Allied force in Helmand province. The person who didn't exist was standing in their hospital, mopping up blood, saving patients, accepting their contempt. Dr. Pierce stood at the back of the crowd, his face cycling through colors like a malfunctioning traffic light. Pale to red to white to a shade of gray that suggested his circulatory system had given up trying to figure out what to do with blood. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He'd spent 3 weeks systematically dismantling someone who'd been trained to survive worse than bureaucratic sabotage. He'd escalated from whispers to formal write-ups to actual termination, weaponizing policy like a scalpel, believing his institutional authority could cut deep enough to destroy her. He'd been wrong in a way that was about to become spectacularly public. The security guard who'd handed Katie her cardboard box of belongings 2 days ago, the same guard who'd watched her accept the box without argument, without trembling, without allowing a single tear to escape, appeared at Dr. Pierce's shoulder. He held an identical cardboard box. His presence beside Pierce was its own form of silence. "I believe you know the way out, Doctor," the guard said quietly. Not a request. Not even really directed at Pierce. A statement delivered to the universe about what was about to happen. Pierce's mouth worked. His hands flexed. He looked toward the admiral, toward the chaplain, toward the CIA officials who were watching him with the expressionless focus of people who'd already decided his fate before he opened his mouth. He had no allies here. The residents he'd enlisted to spread rumors about Katie now stood with their eyes on the floor, understanding that they'd been on the wrong side of history. The nurses who'd whispered with him suddenly became very interested in their charting. He walked toward the elevator. Security moved beside him, not forcefully, not with handcuffs or restraint, but with the kind of professional inevitability that suggests resistance would only delay the inevitable. As he passed the unit board, a nurse, the same one who'd brought Katie coffee on her first day before learning which faction to join, reached up and tore down his write-up. The paper came free with a sound like fabric ripping. She crumpled it without looking at Pierce, without acknowledging him at all. He'd already become invisible. By week's end, the hospital's rumor mill carried the update: Dr. Pierce had been hired at the VA hospital on the south side of Houston. Not in the surgical department. Not in administration. In support services. The position came with a mop and a custodian's uniform and access to the break room where veterans congregated, where old soldiers swapped stories about the people who'd saved them. Katie visited Hayes for discharge follow-up 2 weeks after the reveal. His color had returned. His breathing had normalized. The machine beside him beeped out the rhythm of someone healing exactly as designed. She reviewed his vitals, blood pressure stable, O2 sat 98%, heart rate steady, and allowed herself the smallest smile. "You're going to make it," she said. "Because of you," Hayes replied. He reached into the drawer beside his bed and withdrew a single dog tag on a broken chain, the metal darkened by 3 years in his pocket, worn smooth by his thumb running across it during rehabilitation, during deployment, during the long dark nights when surviving had required believing he'd survive. "I kept this. They told me it belonged to the medic who got me out. I didn't know her name then. I just knew she told me to survive and her hands didn't shake while everything else was falling apart." Katie's breath caught. It was hers. The tag she'd thought she'd lost when the extraction went sideways, when she'd pressed it into Hayes' hand and told him to hold it, to use it as a tether, to survive because surviving meant she didn't have to carry the weight of his death. He'd carried hers instead. He'd kept it against his skin for 3 years, kept it like a talisman, kept it like faith. She unclipped the tag from her neck, the one she'd recovered from her pocket during the parking garage collapse, the one she'd worn underneath her scrubs as proof that she existed, and hung it around her neck alongside the one he returned. 2 tags. 1 identity. Both real. The metal was cool against her skin, and the weight of it felt like the first honest breath she'd taken in 36 months. The Admiral appeared in the doorway, observing the moment without interrupting it. "Captain Rodriguez, your service record has been fully restored. Classification has been partially lifted. You have complete credentials and a standing offer to return to active duty status." Katie looked at the hospital around her, the staff who now greeted her with respect bordering on reverence, the patients she'd saved, the protocols she'd broken to save lives, the ordinary miracles happening in ordinary rooms. She thought of the thoracotomy in Bagram performed with a combat knife because there was no scalpel. She thought of the same procedure performed in this hospital with surgical precision. Same skill. Same person. Different lighting. "I'll stay here, sir," she said quietly. "There's still work to do." The Admiral nodded as if he'd expected exactly this answer. "True heroism has no uniform," he said. "Carry on, Captain." After he left, Katie stood at the window looking out over Houston, the city sprawling beneath her like something she'd finally earned the right to claim. Hayes asked, "What are you thinking?" She touched both dog tags, the cool metal grounding her, anchoring her to both the person she'd been and the person she'd become. "Something someone told me once," she said. "True class is what you do when the lights go out." She paused, and something in her voice shifted, dropped an octave, carried the weight of hard-earned authority. "I've spent 3 years in the dark. Turns out I was exactly where I needed to be." 2 floors below, in a hallway identical to the one Dr. Pierce had once ruled, he stood in a custodian's uniform pushing a mop bucket, listening to 2 veterans in wheelchairs swap stories about a field medic called Sandstorm who'd saved half their unit. He gripped the mop handle. He kept his eyes down. The stories continued, unaware that the man listening understood exactly how completely he'd miscalculated the person he'd tried to destroy. If you found Captain Rodriguez's story as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments, have you ever been completely wrong about someone's true value? And if you want more stories about heroes walking among us, unrecognized until the moment everything changes, like this video and we'll see you next time.